David, putting me on the spot. Deflecting. What was the question again? I have no idea what you're referring to. That much money. We don't really come from family wealth, so you go to Eton, like Max. The connotations the E word would have for the rest of my life. 2 hours of sport every day, 6 times a week is pretty grueling. It was all very weird. And you get Eton 5s. If the kid really wants to go and the kid likes it, then boarding school is great. Politically conscious, 16, 17, 18, had quite different views to a lot of people. Like, voted most likely to work for BuzzFeed. Caveat, I'm definitely not saying I'm, like, very right-wing. I really love the Union. The Union has not produced a single Prime Minister. Outreach with underprivileged kids and public speaking. Obviously, I'm not the best person to say. I happily admit, like, I'm a guy who went to Eton, right? I do way more work for Union in my degree. And I hate the culture war so much. I've listened to quite a few coffees. And, good question. Which is a very political answer, actually. A very politician's answer.
Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to my podcast, Coffees on Me, David Quan, where I strive to give guests legacy-worthy interviews that listeners can enjoy while cooking, commuting, relaxing, or walking their pets. This is yet another weekend episode recorded in London, just after finishing my internship. As always, it is particularly brilliant to enjoy an iced latte this time with my guest. If you have been enjoying the discussions on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts, please do consider leaving a review and nominating a guest by contacting me. And your honest feedback is also really helpful. Recently, for example, following one of the suggestions, I have started to upload previews for each episode. But I'm really excited today to introduce my guest, Max Ghose. Max is an incoming second-year HSPS student at Trinity Hall. He comes from a multicultural family in London and has recently been elected debates officer at the Cambridge Union. Max, welcome to my podcast, Coffees on Me, David Quan.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.
Max, I know that you have listened to previous episodes, and I just want to ask you, why did you want to do this podcast, and what have you learnt from whoever you've listened to so far?
All right, you're really putting me on the spot here, but I've listened to quite a few coffees, and I've listened to Sal. Obviously, Sal and I both come from a union background. And I've listened to the Lily McGrail one, because I applied to Georgetown. I listened to Ms, because we're both on a cooler committee together. So I listened to a decent amount. And, good question, why do I want to come on here? Well, I mean, apart from the fact you're great company, David, it's the sort of thing where in 5 years' time, I sort of want to listen back and remember, like, what my views were and how I found Cambridge and what I believed in. And, you know, there's a good chance I might be like, oh, that guy was so naive, oh, that guy was such an idiot. And there's also a good chance where I look back and I'm sort of slightly proud, and hopefully it's more the latter rather than the former.
Absolutely. I'm sure that our opinions will change, and having a piece of recording like this would be a great memory. And I'm hoping actually to delve a bit more into what made you who you are. Like at Cambridge, you're probably aware that you're known for things like, you know, the union, politics, perhaps for Eton as well.
That is true.
But how was your first year at Cambridge?
I have really, really enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it more than I expected to, if I'm being honest. Before I came to Cambridge, and when I was at school, I was applying to loads of unis, including loads internationally. And I'll be honest, I didn't know whether I really wanted to stay in the UK and whether I wanted to do just one subject, like the British model does. But I've really enjoyed doing politics as part of HSPS. I have some beef with like the sociology and the anthropology part of HSPS, but I'm dropping it now, and we don't need to get into that. And then, of course, there's the union stuff and student politics, and I've really loved sort of getting involved in that. So a real sort of A+ for my first year at Cambridge in terms of my personal experience.
That is wonderful, and I remember the first time meeting you may have been that you were a returning officer for the union's Easter election. And
oh yeah, Mick or Mr. Easter, yeah, that's right.
Yep. And then later on, I remember reading your application for Lit Full Committee, and you probably wrote one of the longest application responses I've ever seen. And I was really impressed by kind of your high level of initiative in school. I think you were president of the Politics Society. You were editor for the Etonomics. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, so I was the political editor. I'll be frank. Of Economics. And yeah, that was all at school before Cambridge.
Yeah, so you obviously had impressive, experiences at Cambridge and before Cambridge. But I want to pull it right back to maybe primary school or where you grew up, and have you lived in UK your whole life? And
all right, this might take a long time. So I'll go even before primary school too. Before I was born. So my dad, God bless him, is Indian by birth, and both his parents are Indian. His family had ties to the UK, but he spent his first 12 years in India, and then when my grandparents got divorced, he moved to the UK with his younger brother and his mum. So he's sort of lived in Britain for a while, but wouldn't look out of place in India. And then my mum, even though his Bengali is a bit sort of ropey and is definitely English as the main language, and then my mum moved to Britain as well, but slightly later in life. So I actually have no idea, but it's somewhere between 18 and 23 she moved. And she's French, and again, that French sort of, she passed her wisdom in French on me, even though my French is very ropey, like my dad's Bengali. So very multicultural family, both my parents being sort of first generation immigrants. So when I was born in London, it was a very multicultural, multilingual household. So that's before primary school. In primary school, I lived in London for basically my whole life until I was 13, and I ended primary school, and that's when I went to boarding school, which I imagine you have a lot of questions for me about.
You were boarding house captain, so we'll definitely get there. But so up until 13, did you go to a private school?
Yes, so I went to a independent school, which is a British way of saying private school. We have all these little words which we use to avoid saying the word private school. But I went to a private day school in London. Even though it was private, it wasn't particularly any good, if I'm being frank. It was, it had great extracurriculars, but its academics weren't that great. And then, the people in my year went to sort of pretty decent secondary schools, and then thanks to my headmaster's guidance, helping my parents, that's when I came across Eton, and I applied. My parents didn't really go through that process, being sort of immigrant. My dad went to private school to take someone on a scholarship, but they aren't really aware of the application processes for these sort of big independent secondary schools. So I applied sort of age 10, 11 at primary school, but up until then I was sort of at a day private school. Not too great, but it still gave me some great opportunities which have come to fruition now.
What kind of kid were you in primary school? The naughty one, the loud one, the social one, academic one, nerdy one?
I think probably academic, if I'm being honest. Honestly, I've sort of got selective amnesia when it comes back to primary school. But I think I always had passions for academics. Things very specific things. Obviously I wasn't studying politics sort of in year one, but history, geography, that sort of thing. And I probably, if I'm being honest, say more the academic / quiet kid rather than the sort of boisterous captain of the football team.
Did you explore any leadership roles in primary school?
Oh God, I can't even remember. So I was house captain of my primary school, in my house in my primary school, and was deputy head boy, but at the time I didn't really feel much of an achievement, and if I'm being honest, it was sort of if you behaved well and you did well in your academics, but we had a year in year 8 of about 12 people, so one of the 12 was going to be head boy, and one of the it was a co-ed school, but so we had 2 girls in my year. One of the sort of 10 was going to be head boy, and one of the 10 was going to be deputy head boy, so it wasn't too difficult.
Your parents being immigrants, do you feel like they adapted well in the new environment, and did they instill into you a certain kind of value, or did they share particular anecdotes from their move? Because it's quite challenging to move.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I feel like, with absolutely no disrespect to my mum whatsoever, I feel like it was a bit more challenging for my dad. My dad, who had lived in India, in, I think, Calcutta, in Bombay, sort of moved one day, age 12, and he had family over here, but it's, like, quite a different environment, and he was sort of, and, you know, my grandmother at the time wasn't, like, earning that much money. We don't really come from family wealth, so he was put in a random state school, and he had to, like, and he was academic too, but he had to really work hard in a way that, like, me or my brothers didn't necessarily have to, and get a scholarship. So I can imagine, like, how that experience has, like, grown into this ethos of, like, working hard and putting that on his kids, and I feel like I've certainly got that from my dad.
Was it more his example of hard work, or did he consciously make an effort to highlight these values in your upbringing?
I mean, like any child, I think, like, you're going to look at, especially for a boy, you're going to look at your dad and be like, especially if you're like, so my 8-year-old brother, so I've got an 8-year-old brother, quite a big age gap, and, like, he looks at my dad and he's like, you know, in his life, he's like, you know, he's like the goal, he's like his hero, basically. So my 8-year-old brother is like, you know, he's only started walking and talking in the last 6 years, but he already says, oh, I want to go to Eton like Max, and then I want to go to Merton College, Oxford, to do history like Dad. So he's sort of combining the two of us. There's quite a big age gap between the two of us, so I can see how I've sort of, like, crept in there. But if you're a kid, you're going to see, especially a boy, you're going to see your dad, and you're going to be like, that's my hero, that's how I want to be. And I feel like there was a bit of sort of pushing from my dad, but it was more of a, I want, like, his values, I want to do as well as him.
So schools like Eton, as you mentioned before, is quite a loaded kind of word in the UK, to say the least. When you were 10, 11, you first saw Eton, you first thought about applying there and the possibilities of getting in. Were you more excited? Were you daunted? Did you realise how much that would be a part of you? Like, I don't know, do you remember much about that initial impression of Eton?
I mean, I remember a lot about the process. So when I was 10, 11, my parents, again, they didn't go from it themselves. They had to, like, sort of learn on the job from, like, people in my primary school about, like, how you do the process of getting into secondary schools. And I remember I first visited Eton age sort of 10 in year 5, which is first crazy because I only left, like, a year ago, age 18, and I visited when I was sort of 9 or 10, and that was sort of 2.5 years before I actually got there. So, one, I think the system's crazy. But, sorry, going back to your question, I was excited and daunted, but I didn't realise, being a sort of quite sheltered 10-year-old, the connotations the E word would have for the rest of my life, and still has, and still is a part of me today. All I did was I visited a few schools, did some tests, got into some, didn't get into others, and of the ones I got into, I sort of remember, like, which one did I prefer visiting. I'm like, oh, I like Eton because it's got all the cricket pitches and all the football pitches, and because the woman who toured me around the school is really lovely. That's all I really knew about Eton. There wasn't anything my dad, like, did you know that David Cameron went here? Or did you know that Boris Johnson went here? Or that, ex-Prime Minister went here? I didn't understand the sort of cultural connotations of big independent private schools, never mind that specific private school. So all I remember was being a naive 10-year-old sort of rocking up to these exams, and, fortunately for me, I passed the exam and the interview, age 10 or whatever, and thinking, I want to go to boarding school. That's another thing. It wasn't like my parents pushed it on me. I really wanted to go to boarding school because I thought I was quite an independent child. I think it was definitely the right decision. I'm a big advocate of boarding school if the kid likes it, is the big caveat. If the kid really wants to go and the kid likes it, then boarding school is great. And I really want to go to boarding school, and then I ended up there, and the rest is history.
It's amazing. I mean, when I was 9 or 10, I certainly didn't think about the possibility of leaving home to attend boarding school, which probably shows some early signs of you, as you said, being quite independent and driven and motivated. when you got to Eton, I mean, having talked to a lot of people who, you know, start in a school and then move to a private school, for example, they may find the environment more structured, you know, having to wear maybe ties and polish your shoes and not being able to walk on the grass and all those kind of traditions. Do you remember how that was like adapting? What kind of traditions did Eton have for those who didn't attend?
Yeah, so I mean, the biggest thing you've got to adapt to is, well, the boarding aspect. So before I went, I hadn't boarded before, and I thought I'd really like it, and eventually I did. But being a 13-year-old, when you're 13, you think, you know, you can do anything and that you're the king of the world and whatever, and but like you can face any challenge. But like going from being in the comfort of your home, and I'm not saying sort of Eton is at all uncomfortable, but it is, you know, it is a challenging experience being away from your family, you know, not seeing your parents for, you know, at least 3 weeks at a time, age 13, before when you see them every day. So that's a big thing you would adapt to, and I don't think I mentioned it, but when I was 13 and I started boarding school, my parents actually, with my brothers, moved abroad, to a different continent, in fact. So it wasn't like I could just pop around home on the weekends.
Wow.
It was a big challenge. Eventually I got into the rhythm and I really liked boarding, but that's probably the biggest challenge. I mean, obviously there's all the other traditions, like, you know, doing 2 hours of sport every day, 6 times a week is pretty grueling. You know, back in primary school, I wasn't very competitive academically, primary school, so I was like pretty much at the higher end of the spectrum academically. When you get to Eton, there's 250 boys, and it's just boys, unfortunately. I have thoughts about single sex education and co-education, and there's 250 boys, and you're sort of, you know, you're disposable, basically. So there was a lot of adapting.
Sport is certainly very character shaping, and I for example, credit my time playing basketball, playing team sport, coaching basketball was very formative experiences. For you, was it cricket?
Oh, no, not at all.
Not at all?
I like watching cricket, but I think, and obviously I'm half Indian, and my dad's family love watching cricket. I don't think I played cricket a single time in my 5 years, which I think is quite impressive considering a lot of people were forced to play cricket. But sorry, go on.
I thought that because when you said you visited Eton, you're like, oh, great cricket ground.
Yes, I'm sorry.
But what were your kind of extracurricular things beyond just like politics and economics, the intellectual side of things?
So, I mean, there's a lot of sports at Eton, and it's not necessarily everyone's cup of tea. I mean, I didn't mind it. I loved playing football. I wasn't necessarily very good at it. I made teams. I didn't make the first team. That's for sure. And I enjoyed the sporting aspect. I think I found it a bit too much at first, because you go from primary school and doing sports maybe like 2-3 times a week to sort of like, and because I hadn't gone to a sort of feeder school for Eton, right? A lot of these guys in their first year had gone to schools like Summerfield and the Dragon and stuff, and you start from like 7. Some of them are boarding, and like they're into the rhythm. So for them, Eton is sort of like just sort of a continuation of that. Whereas I, you know, lived at home, it was a bit less grueling. But in terms of co-curriculars, yeah, you had the sports, you know, as any sort of 13-year-old boy did, loved playing football. You had all these weird Eton-only sports. So there was a thing called a field game, and for like, you know, for the sort of non-Etonians, which I imagine is the 99.9% of people listening to this, the field game was like this game of like a mixture between football and rugby, and it was all very weird, and you had Eton Fives. There's some very odd extracurriculars which I got involved in. But if I'm being honest, David, you can't really separate my co-curriculars from the politics, from the economics, because again, like, if you ask people at uni, like, that's probably what I'm into, and if you ask people at school, that's definitely what I was, I think I got voted in the sort of Superlatives magazine, like, most likely to work for like BuzzFeed or something, because of my sort of socially conscious politics.
That's awesome, and obviously Eton was a school that offered these kind of opportunities, and I mean, Was your school heavy on like inter-year level relationships? Like the school I went to, for example, like as a year 7 going in, like I knew the year 11s, I knew the year 12s, and we would interact. And at lunchtimes, you could definitely kick a football with the older years and the younger years. And I thought that was really good because on the one hand, as a younger student, you could learn from their example and look up to them, and they've obviously been where I was. And for the older students, it's a chance to kind of give back and mentor. Was that very much a part of the boarding house culture there?
So I think one of the proudest things from my time of Eton that sort of I've done that people in my year did, and when I was house captain, I really sort of tried to instill this, is that when I first joined, so for context, in Eton they've bought lots of boarding houses, about 25 boarding houses. There are 5 years, about 50 people in a boarding house, about 10 a year, if that makes sense. And then you join and you're 13, you're living with 18-year-olds, basically. People who are ready to leave, people who are basically adults.
That is, yeah.
And when I first joined, I didn't feel like there was that sort of cohesion between the years. I felt like it was quite hierarchical, and that like, obviously as a new boy you're going to be daunted and you're going to be nervous. I feel like that environment sort of added fuel to the fire, whereas when I left sort of 4.5, 5 years later, and I had a different housemaster, and I really liked the housemaster we got by the end of my time at Eton. I feel like there was a lot more or we called years blocks for some, a lot of weird terminology going on here, which I won't get into. But there's a lot more sort of block harmony. And one of the things I'm really proud of, as I said, as house captain and the people in my years, we really tried to instill that. And some of my really good friends from school are 2 people in the year below and 2 people in the year above even in my house. So I feel like it was more of a process rather than, starting from the get-go.
Absolutely. And like I said before, I think there is value for that inter-year level communication, and both parties benefit. And I was wondering, I really hate this question, like being asked it myself, but nevertheless, it gives you an opportunity to share about more of your routine. But what was like a typical day in the board, like at Eton?
Okay, here we go. It's like a blog almost. So well, without being cliche, no 2 days are like each other, but I'll try and give you the average day. So let's say you're a new boy. You have to get up at about 7:30 for 7:45 breakfast in the house. Some houses you eat in the house, some houses you eat in like a sort of communal cafeteria, but I was eating in the house. So wake up at 7:30, 7:45 breakfast. Then 8:30 you had chapel. And we had chapel about 6 times a week, Sunday service being sort of like an hour to 90 minutes, which was awful and which everyone would try to get out of. Then lessons from 9 to 11:20. 11:20 you had this thing called chambers, which my mum referred to as 11s. It's basically like a mid-morning snack, because you do so much lessons and activities and extracurriculars, you need like a lot of food in the day. 11:45 to 1:15 more lessons. Then you have lunch either back in your boarding house or in the cafeteria. Then let's say it's a Monday, which is a full day. Again, some weird terminology about full days and half days. So on a full day you go sports from 2 to 4:30. So that's, you had grounds near the boarding house, go play football for 2 hours, come back. On a full day, you're not done. You've got lessons again from 4:30 to 6. Then quiet hour, which is when you did your homework, 6 to 7. Dinner, 7:30 to sort of 8:30. And then if you want, you had sort of societies, a bit like Cambridge. I mean, less sort of student run, but still sort of headed by students. And then sort of 8:30 onwards, which was sort of optional if you wanted to go. So it's a pretty intense, full-on day. And you're 13, and you come here and you sort of have like a 12-hour plus day. It's quite grueling to get used to.
For sure. Now that you're a bit older, I'm sure you still keep in contact with some of those people who you first met, perhaps your first class. Did anyone from the get-go really impress you, and perhaps you were still friends and you've obviously grown up together? And could you name drop some people?
I know who you're...
And maybe you could send the podcast to them.
I might have an inkling about who you're talking about, but Ed Hilditch is someone I went to school with, and I actually was in year 9, which we call F block at Eton. I was in his, which is our first year. I was in his French class, and I'm actually fluent in French. My French is like quite crap considering I'm fluent in French. But he was, he was pretty insane back at school. In sort of academically sort of on it. I think Ed, we had sort of like end of year exams at Cambridge. We had these things called trials, so academic trials, and Ed would, I think, won like a decent amount of the overall trials prizes. So every single subject,
wow,
you get a trials prize. So I think he's going to be annoyed if I say this, but he came second, I think, over 5 years to another one. He went to Danny.
I thought to you.
No, not to me. I was actually very academically sort of like mediocre at most things. It just so happened I was pretty decent at, like, you know, social science, history, politics. But no, I think you're alluding to Ed, and I'll pass the podcast on to him.
Well, he's certainly very impressive, and obviously I don't know him from the school days, but like working with him for the Cambridge Student Investment Fund at the Union, just very switched on, and I know he'll be listening to this. But I guess, no, actually the reason why I asked it wasn't for you to necessarily bring a particular person in, but I remember that like there was a friend of mine that came in like year 9, and like at that point I was, you know, very dedicated on basketball. I was representing South Australia for the state basketball team. I was very dedicated for music. I was in 4 or 5 different ensembles. Academically I was trying hard, but that friend that came in, he was, you know, reading self-help books, reading psychology books, doing drama, doing public speaking, doing like coding and all these like activities that weren't offered in the school. And I thought just seeing a peer of mine go above and beyond really just changed my whole approach to learning. And he was, for example, someone that showed to me that, you know, schooling alone does not like encompass the holistic dimension of education. And I just wonder, like, surely in that kind of boarding house environment, your habits and assumptions would have been challenged, and like in what ways did your peers, very impressive peers I'm sure, shape your decisions and that kind of stuff?
Oh yeah, certainly. I mean, I feel like when I got to Eton, I didn't have a work ethic at all. I remember my first set of exams, which was like end of first term, like I remember like I didn't really do that much work. I thought I'd be okay, get my sort of piece of paper with all my results on them. I wasn't okay. It was like I didn't get any sort of, I didn't fail any exams, but like I wasn't really, like if you saw that results paper and then you said to like my tutor, my housemaster, oh, that guy's going to Cambridge in 4.5 years time, like it wouldn't really be that realistic. And that's, I think, because I didn't go to sort of like a hothouse primary school, so I didn't have that work ethic. And like there are things, you know, obviously like work isn't the be all and end all, but I thought myself quite an academic person, and then going to an environment like that, and then sort of realizing, oh, actually you've got to shift gears a bit, and then from people around me, not necessarily my house, but like sort of, well, both my house and outside, I realized what sort of working hard meant, and like I didn't push myself before I got to Eton in the sort of academic realm, because I was always like, you know, like without teaching my home, like pretty like in the, you know, top quartile of like my year, and now I'm like just some like random, I'm just some random guy. So that really sort of pushed me, both the influences of my peers and my friends, and also the pressure, if I'm being honest, like that combined really pushed me. And then I think like in terms of being challenged throughout my 5 years, and like I'm sorry for going back to the politics, but I did have a lot of conversations in the boarding house about politics, often ending in disagreements. I felt like I had, especially when I sort of got more sort of politically conscious, 16, 17, 18, had quite different views to a lot of people. and sometimes challenging those views really helped me form. Sometimes I'd agree with them, sometimes I'd change my views, but a lot of the time it really helped me form my arguments and form my beliefs in a sort of more advanced way. So whether you agree with them or not, I feel like being challenged by a lot of the people in the boarding house at Eton on sort of politics and social views was a really good learning experience.
On that point about challenging and being challenged and changing your mind, do you remember something like a view that you had that you ultimately changed your mind in?
Sort of politically,
Yeah.
or I mean, oh, good question. So I'm not going to answer your question immediately, which is a very political answer actually, a very politician's answer. But just to give some background, when I started sort of getting politically conscious, involved in politics, and I was coming from an environment like Eton, I often felt like I was like sort of rabidly left wing in that environment, and I felt like, because it's all I know, and I don't know like how many people know about the Overton window. It's basically like if you're exposed to certain, it's like a range of views which you're exposed to, and of those views, I was, especially on social issues, I thought I was very, very progressive. And I think going to university has made me realise, actually, like, quite controversially, I'm actually quite a bit more right-wing than I thought I was. So, like, a really random example I'll throw out to you is on, like, free trade. I used to sort of read a lot about sort of protectionism and tariffs, and then like I used to be quite sort of trade deals, anti-EU on that regards. And then my positions have evolved going to Cambridge. So that's a really random example I've just thrown out of you. But I've had a lot of views which have changed throughout my time at Eton and then going to Cambridge. But I mean, free trade's a big one, I think, now.
Yeah, well, I think it takes a lot of humility and maturity to be able to admit that you have changed on certain views, and I'm certain that.
Sorry, a good one's the monarchy, actually.
Okay.
That's actually slightly more sexy than free trade. So at Eton, I used to be almost Liz Truss-esque, actually, the sort of switch. I don't know if you've seen the Liz Truss video where she's at that Lib Dem party conference and is calling for the abolition of the monarchy. But I used to basically be a Republican, or if not a Republican, was quite sort of like, oh, these guys are a waste of time and space and anti-monarchy. And now I'd say I'm quite firmly pro-constitutional monarchy. Sorry, that was just a slightly more interesting example than the free trade one.
But yeah, I mean, I can understand that when you first got to Eton, you didn't really grasp the connotations, and I guess as you got to the end of your time, for someone like you who was so well read, you definitely would have considered about the place that you attend school, and now that you've been at university and hearing more perspectives, obviously Cambridge is still a bubble.
Yeah, no doubt.
But how have that evolved?
Yeah, so I mean, it goes back to sort of what I said. I thought that being sort of socially progressive, in my view, sort of at Eton, or at least I would call them socially progressive in terms of that environment, right? Like, it's all relative, right? Like, being again, I think, I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but in the school magazine, like, I was like voted most likely to work for BuzzFeed, because that was the perception of me, that like I was some sort of like rabid left winger or something in the context of Eton, and like for really like not that impressive in terms of like socially conscious things. Like I thought, and I used to tell people that I thought that being a single sex school was like archaic, and that Eton should become a like co-educational school, and we should have men and women, because that reflects real life and prepares both sexes real world, and rather than being in some sort of like archaic institution where you're just teaching boys, right? So like literally sort of bare minimum, at least in my view, things like that was seen as socially progressive. Maybe I'll even use the doubly word woke. Whereas when I get to Cambridge and I arrived here and I realised that like my views, rather than being sort of left-wing, were actually like for the most part quite either basic or even even sort of slightly right-wing, which is a I don't know, controversial thing to say. So yeah, my politics and my views have definitely changed over the sort of last 5 years, and weirdly sort of got more sort of liberal, more right wing as I got older. And so caveat, I'm definitely not saying I'm like very right wing. I just sort of the evolution of my views. So yeah, and look, I joined Kula at Cambridge. So that's a sort of like pretty good description of where I'm at right now.
Great. We could probably talk all day about politics and that kind of
I'm
stuff.
I'm sure we
Eton,
could.
But I want to like hear more about you, because this podcast is about you. But you've obviously achieved a lot, and I don't believe that achievements purely come 100% naturally. Like it's a lot of decision making, it's a lot of hard work, it's a lot of working smart, grit, seeking out mentors, taking on feedback, and just conscious choices.
Well, and a lot of luck too.
And a lot of luck as well, for sure. And I was just wondering, what were some habits that you adopted maybe during your teenage years or whenever that you felt like really contributed to your achievements?
I'm very keen on like the bigger picture. And I mean, it's quite cliche to say sort of like don't let setbacks sort of slow your progression. Like I've had quite a few setbacks over like my 5 years at Eton and my first year at Cambridge, right? Whether it be not getting a role I wanted, not winning a certain like election or something, but I've always tried, and sometimes I fail myself, but I've always tried to look at the bigger picture of where I want to be in sort of X months, X years time. So I really try and not to let failure get to me too much is basically it.
It's very easy to say that, and I'm
Yeah.
sure you try very hard, and we all have these coping mechanisms and look ahead, but I'm sure it still hurts when you...
Oh yeah, no doubt.
And I was wondering, could you maybe pull one or two concrete examples and just how you've actually dealt with it? Was there any like strategies? Did you seek out mentors? Is there a framework with which you deal with challenges for resilience?
Well, I guess it's a sort of cop-out answer, really, but maybe it's not a cop-out answer, but I ran for Kula chair at the end of Lent term, so it's like I'd say my most recent example in Cambridge, and I lost to Josh Ann, and it turns out that actually that was a really good thing for me, and honestly, I'm actually quite glad. Obviously, it's like easy to say this and benefit of hindsight. But one, I think Josh Ann's excellent, will be an excellent chair for like the next year, like that goes without saying. But two, like it's like taking a step back. I sort of ran for the chair because it was like the next thing to do. When actually I'm not sure whether it was something I really wanted to do. And like obviously like I would have enjoyed the job, would have like relished the responsibility, but sometimes I think people get really, especially like in an environment of like Cambridge politics, it's a very like specific niche environment, but get really hung up about the next step on the ladder and whether they actually want it or not. So I feel like that's a bit of a cop-out answer on the sort of coping thing, but that's just like my most recent experience with that at Cambridge.
Well, thank you for sharing about that. I know it's never easy to talk about the times that we have lost or failed, and certainly takes a lot of courage. So thank you for sharing. And I like the attitude of having a big picture and resilience, but I do want to hear a bit more tangibly or concretely about what were some of the actions you have done to reach the successes you've had. Like, for example, like me using basketball again as a cop out. Like, I remember after not playing as much as I wanted in that off season, I went to train 6 times a week. In the holidays, I was there at like 7 a.m. and try and be the first to come, last to leave. And like, what were they for you? Like, perhaps you've gone above and beyond to read or sacrifice partying time. Like, yeah.
I mean, certainly, as you say, the sort of first to come in, let's use the office, first to come in the office, last to leave, for example, is great, and like hard work and time and commitment and prioritizing things is going to get you far. But I feel like sort of pivoting from that, the most important thing is your headspace and your mentality. And actually, again, I'm sort of going back to the cooler answer, but it's sort of taking a step back and prioritizing what you want for yourself, not necessarily what's expected of you. Then let's go to the habits, right? So, I mean, what I do at Cambridge is a lot of union stuff, maybe to the detriment of my degree. And I'd say, like, I really enjoy that, and I'd say I've done, pretty decently at that. And it's, I mean, in that sort of thing, it's all about the grunt work, it's all about putting the time in. And, yeah, I mean, I don't really have any sort of...
So you just put in the hours.
I mean, yeah, it's an easy thing to say, but and again, it depends on the context, right? Like, I'm sure I'm not part of CAMSIF, but I'm sure CAMSIF, you not only need to put in the hours, but you also have to be quite an innovative thinker, and be well read, and be sort of like constantly changing your approach, looking at the news, that sort of thing. So I guess it depends on the task at hand, is again another cop-out answer.
That's great, and you don't have to answer this, and this is me trying to stretch you, but you mentioned with Kulo chair, that's like a natural next step. You've just been elected vice chair of Kulo.
Yes.
And then for the union, you've been elected debates officer, and historically debates officer often run for president. I know things change, and you've obviously had to deal with that, but what's your perhaps politician answer to will you run for president?
Well, David, putting me on the spot. I couldn't possibly say. I mean, constitutionally, first and foremost, I can't announce any races or whatnot before, like, for months and months and months now.
But foolish political decision.
Sorry. Deflecting. What was the question again? Am I, like, what's the next step?
I think instead of me asking you, will you run for president, I'm sure that a lot of people ask you that. So what would be your response, and with a bigger picture in mind?
Okay. I'd say... Okay, firstly, can I just address the cooler stuff? And
Sure.
I will get to a question. This is very political as well. I really enjoy working with people at Cooler, but I don't feel like I can run for Cooler chair again, and I am allowed to say that, I think. One, because I feel like it's someone else's turn to run for chair. 2, because I feel like my priorities of what I want to do at Cambridge have shifted and, like, taking a step back. And 3, I think is the most important point, I am sort of small L liberal by nature, but I am not a member of a Liberal Democrats. And I feel like... I'm not a member of any political party, by the way, not just to point that out. And I feel like it would be both unfair and, like, foolish for me I voted for different parties before, but I feel like it'd be foolish and unfair for me to be chair of what is ostensibly like the Student Liberal Democrat Society without being a Liberal Democrat member. Anyway, sorry, going to the union. I really love the union. I want to see it succeed. I want to stay involved as much as I can. I've got really big ideas for debates, and I want to implement reforms. And last but not least, I'm not allowed to publicly say anything.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I asked that question. I know it's a tricky one, having been on a standing committee myself before. And my point wasn't really to put you on the spot, but more to firstly give you a chance to kind of see and show how you respond to difficult, like being in student politics is difficult. It's a lot of scrutiny.
It's very weird for I'm not even 20.
And these are tricky like questions.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm sure you were in standing committee with Keir, who was probably 2021. Back in Michaelmas, and you had to deal with a lot of tricky questions, and a lot of people forget that, like, obviously it's a great privilege to be on standing committee, it's a great privilege to be president of a union, but for James Vitale, he's obviously a PhD student. Apart from James, all the last presidents have been undergraduates, sort of 2021. So it's sort of very difficult shoes to fill when you don't have life experience. Well, that's why James was such a great president, because he was, as you can attest, because he was a PhD student and he was 27 and he was really able to bring that sort of work and life experience to the role.
Absolutely, and yeah, so I mean, nevertheless, by being on standing committee and holding these roles, you do still have responsibility to to serve with integrity and in a manner consistent with the values of the organisation.
No, of course.
And awareness of wider society. So, what, in your opinion, are one or two things the union can do better on?
Look, before I answer that, I feel like the union gets a lot of bad rep unjustly. But answering your question, I feel like the image we portray ourselves is that of... Okay, sorry. It's not the image we portray ourselves, but it's the image a lot of people have, and which we really need to work hard on dispelling, is the image that the union is basically for... it's like a breeding ground, it's a training ground for future politicians who are sort of inevitably white men and conservative. I'd point to the record that the union has not produced a single prime minister.
Is that right?
Yeah, so no, we've got close in the past. So Rob Butler newly became prime minister. Okay. Michael Howard was the leader of opposition, and then we've had a few others. But okay, so that was a pedantic answer. If you actually look at the union standing committee, full committee, I think people would be positively surprised about the efforts we're making to sort of dispel that semi-myth. I think in terms of just like from a marketing publicity standpoint, obviously we can do better, and it doesn't help when we have sort of debates on like, was the British Empire a good thing? No offense to Sam, but I don't think that was a wise thing to have, considering the perception of like what the union is for some people. So I think that's one of the things the union can do better. On actually like showing that like, so I've got Ellie, who's the Equalities Officer for Michaelmas, a really good friend of mine, and like she does so much work on standing committee. She like in organising sort of outreach with underprivileged kids and public speaking, and like we're sort of like semi-adopted your idea of like school visits and stuff. We're having a lot of interaction with local I'm sure it does with lots of local schools, and so like I'd say like just look at someone like Ellie and all the work she's doing, and like the tangible benefit she has. Her equality subcommittee is great. People like Alex Horan and stuff are doing like such good work, for accessibility and for, like, we can't just say, like, we're not elitist, we have to, like, you know, we have to show it. Obviously, I'm not the best person to say it. I happily admit, like, I'm a guy who went to Eton, right? But, like, that's not what standing committee and full committee is. I just happen to be from that background. There are a lot of people doing a lot of good work on that front. So that's a really long answer.
No, great. And yeah, I mean, we can again talk all day about the union, but I think there's obviously a lot of debate about it. But one thing that, well, from my perspective, that is undisputable is how much work and pressure is actually put on the standing committee.
Yeah, people don't realise, and like I've just been elected, and like obviously I ran for the position. I really
it's still a
relish
privilege, though. It's
yeah, I know, 100%.
Privilege.
But I will say, like, I'm super grateful for the X amount of people who voted for me, the people who've let me advice, to Keir, James, and Letty for, you know, all that. But like people don't realise if you're not on the full committee, especially not on the standing committee, how much work. Basically, the union, I do way more work for the union than my degree. And like my degree is not thanking me for it. But and it's my choice. I want to do it because I feel like the union has a real impact on discourse, on student politics, on debate, on free speech, and on important issues. And I, you know, happily will do it. But people don't realise how much work it is.
Change of tone. What's your favourite fruit, Max?
My favourite fruit? Well, I think my mum or my girlfriend would pessimistically say I don't like any fruit. What is my favourite fruit? Maybe, let's be boring, a good old apple.
Good old apple. What was one of the best books that you've read recently?
Okay, so I've read 2 books, and you're going to laugh at one of them. So the book I'm currently reading now is called Churchill Walking with Destiny, I think, by Andrew Roberts. And it's a 1,000-page biography on Winston Churchill.
Wow.
I've got about sort of 400, 500 pages through it.
I love biographies
because I don't know if these are meant to be quick-fire questions, but
no, go on.
Churchill is a super interesting and super complicated person in like the tapestry of our nation's history. And I feel like it was very important for me to read the book. I'm not done with the book, so I've only got to sort of the 1920s, and he finishes in like the 1950s. But I'm really enjoying it, and I feel like a lot of I'm going into a grand political speech now, so forgive me, but there's a lot of discourse now, like within the context of a culture war, on certain issues, and Churchill is a cultural issue, and I hate the culture war so much, and I feel like I'm a historian, but a lot of historians will say we need a lot of nuance on people like Churchill, and Churchill did some really bad things, both like just sort of like policy things when he was Chancellor of Exchequer, and like he was like undoubtedly like a racist guy, right? He's definitely sort of no hero in the context of his personal views. That being said, I think it's important we learn about our history, and I think it's important that we don't talk about people in an unnuanced way. Churchill was a hero, he saved us from the Nazis, or Churchill was evil, he had racist views in the 1890s when he was fighting in South Africa or elsewhere. So it was a long answer, and I'm sure we could talk about Churchill and whatnot. Culture was forever. Then another book, which you're going to laugh at. I recently read Arena of Ambition, A History of the Cambridge Union by Lord Stephen Parkinson. A really great book, actually. I'm sure
very fitting title.
Yeah, I'm sure I am in the very small demographic who really loves the book. But I think it's one, like, so Gina Holmes, who's a really good friend of mine, who's social events officer in Easter term, lent it to me, and I found it fascinating purely because like I spend a lot of time in the institution, spend a lot of time in the building. Like it's quite interesting and nice learning about the history, and also it teaches you lessons. And the book stops in the 90s, and I obviously can't say it, but for reasons. But I have taken up some ideas from a book which I want to implement in that term. So it might be a very self-congratulatory book to read, but I really enjoyed reading it.
No, well, I'm excited to see what comes about in your term, and you clearly put in a lot of effort for it. But back to the reading question. When you actually read a book, do you annotate? Do you take notes? Do you summarize? How do you digest and ensure that what you're reading is most efficient and effective?
Well, really good question. And like, I really want to be one of those people who sort of like reads immensely and just sort of digests loads of knowledge, and it stays in my head. Unfortunately, one, it doesn't often stay in my head, and two, I'm often a lot of the time like too busy, or if I'm being honest, too lazy to read as much as I should be. So it depends if I'm reading casually or for work. For work, it's usually a bit more of a slog, a bit more of a bore, because I have to, like, you know, get the quotations, sort of note them down, some sort of annotating with my iPad, right? Key quotations for, like, which I'm going to include in my essay. But more interestingly, when I read casually, a good habit that I've picked up is at the end of every chapter, basically put the book down and sort of actually physically write it out with a pen. Like, basically just summarize it. A couple sentences, and then that can be, like, on the notes app on your phone if you, like, you want to keep it all together. But I feel like that's really useful, especially, like, maybe not, like, so much for fictional books, but especially, like, for non-fictional books when, like, you want to, like, immerse yourself in content. If, like, you want to learn about new things, it's a really good way just to sort of, like, you know, like, recap at the end, and a really good way to, like, keep the key points in your mind. I wish I had like a supersonic memory, but I don't.
No, that's a great habit, and yeah, being able to shorten something and get out its key thesis and message is certainly a very crucial skill. And obviously, the world that we live in now is full of information, it's full of data, but not enough knowledge and wisdom in that sense. And being able to think very critically is something that clearly you're paying attention to. So the podcast is to give you a legacy-worthy interview, Max. Is there any other aspects of your life that you would like to include in this recording?
Oh God, I feel like we've covered a lot, and the time has gone by really quickly. I mean, I could talk about endlessly.
You look a bit emotional. Am I reading yourself right? Like, how are you feeling at the moment? Because we've talked about some pretty deep topics.
I mean, like,
personal.
Often sort of at the end of a Zoom call, at the end of, like, talking for a long time, I get quite sort of drained. But, like, I do think it's worthwhile to, like, to talk about yourself, because it's sort of, I mean, like, in quite a cliche way, it's sort of like you're able to reflect on yourself better, and, like, listening to a podcast back, I'm sure I'll be able to reflect on, like, whether I listen to it, like, you know, in a couple weeks' time or in 20 years. I feel like sort of seeing different points of your life and being able to reflect on it is a really good way to I mean, grow, really. I don't think there's really anything else I want to talk about. I have a lot of things which I talk about a lot. I'm sure my friends, I have a few things I talk about a lot, which I'm sure my friends and family can attest to. Like, it's inevitably politics, student politics, the union, because it's basically what I do at Cambridge.
Actually, if you don't mind, I know listeners would be very curious, and I probably know a lot of the answers myself.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we talk about the behind the scenes of the campaign? I know you've worked on.
Oh yeah, I don't mind at all. Go fire.
Yeah, I know
away.
Union campaigns are quite mysterious, and having run two myself and helped other people as well and being involved, it's quite a different beast, and it's very. It depends who you are in the campaign. It could either be daunting, it could be very exciting, it could be very ambiguous, but for someone coming into Cambridge, what does it take, or in your opinion, you have seen past campaigns. Perhaps that's easier without talking about your campaign, breaking any rules, but What have been like good elements of a great campaign in the Cambridge Union context, at least?
I mean, there are very different ways to do a campaign, and I'm sure like one of your previous podcast guests, Sal, will attest to. So Sal ran a very, let's say, unorthodox campaign with his poster and his like public messaging and his singing, which I hope the rest of standing committee isn't going to adopt the sort of union sing along, but there are really different ways to run a campaign. I think it's easiest to talk about my own personal experience.
Okay, go for it.
But I didn't always know I was going to be a part of a union. In Michaelmas, I joined Cambridge. I knew I wanted to get membership. I heard about the Oxford Union, I heard about Cambridge Union. I'm like, I want to be here. I want to see these people. I want to be in these debates. Then very quickly, I realised I couldn't help myself but get involved. Joined full committee, joined Kula, that sort of thing. I think from about Lent is when I first started seriously thinking, okay, I might actually want to do this. I didn't really have an inkling of running before, but I knew people, like just being the orator after a Thursday night, like you get to meet a whole variety of weird and wonderful people. I think I first met yourself on a Thursday night.
So I guess I'm the former.
I couldn't possibly say, David. And then running an election, like it can basically be, it is what you make of it. So Sal decided. So I knew I wanted to run for debates for ages. I almost ran for debates in Lent. I decided I didn't because, like for a whole host of reasons. But by the election of Lent, I knew I was going to run the next term. I think Sal decided he was going to run a couple weeks before, and so there's really no one way to run a campaign. I feel like proven experience on full committee and other roles is a really good way to show yourself. It isn't the be all and end all, but I had been on a lot of subcommittees, whatever. Although I do have to mention I did run against Ron, so I didn't really have the toughest of time in the actual voting. But it is what you make of it. If you want to run, join full committee, join subcommittees, show your dedication, show you really want to be involved, do the grunt work, and people will notice. It isn't an old boys club like some detractors want to think it is. And again, I'm not the best person to put forward this message because, well, one, my background, schooling, whatever, and two, I've got really good friends from the union. That doesn't mean like I'm just friends with them because they're in the union, but you spend so much time together. Like two of my best friends at Cambridge are Ed and Ellie, who are both on standing committee, really good friends with Gina and so on. I made really good friends at the union, but it isn't necessarily about who you know, it's about how much work you put in. And that gets it. Sal sent out so many invitations in that term for Ollie Uddy's Speakers Committee. And that was really noticed by people. So put in the work, and very often you'll get some rewards.
Well, you're definitely someone who shows initiative and have done a lot of hard work as well. I remember when we chatted in the Orator and you mentioned that like you've already read my How to Get Involved guide and you remembered bits and pieces from there, which I thought was just really impressive. And I think those very much is back to those habits of showing up, putting in the grunt work, and it is often a lot of sacrifice, and certainly best of luck if you decide to take it further. Hopefully,
I have no idea what you're referring to, Dave.
Arena of ambition, indeed. A few rapid fire questions just to finish off.
I'll try to answer them quickly. Although I am a big talker, as you might have guessed, so I'll try and be abrupt.
Oh, actually, there's one more part.
Fire away.
Corporate world.
Ooh.
You did an internship at McKinsey. You talked about that you have obviously gone through the process of applying for a lot of internships, and yeah, what is it like to apply for internships? And I know at Cambridge, obviously, that's what people want to do for their second year summer.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm being frank, it's a lot of hours and a lot of preparation, and you have to be, especially if you're applying for these corporate internships, whether it be investment banking or consulting or law. I have less experience in law, but especially investment banking and consulting, it's a lot of energy, a lot of effort, a lot of time, and a lot of the time, unfortunately, you're going to be disappointed. I didn't apply to that many spring weeks, but I got quite a few rejections. And I expect to get many, like, I'm not saying it's necessarily a reflection on my applications, but because of how competitive these summer internships are, I expect to get quite a few rejections. And, like, some advice, whether you're in my year or you're applying to grad programs or, like, you're coming into Cambridge and want to apply for spring weeks, like, you have to be prepared that these sort of internships, whether it be like at a JP Morgan top investment bank or like MBB consulting, are gonna be quite demoralizing, going through applying for like half a dozen, in my case I'm gonna be applying to dozens, and that's quite a slog. And yeah, I did the McKinsey Spring Week. I was fortunate to get a place there, but like I can't rest on my laurels. It doesn't convert to a summer internship. I have to reapply to their summer internship, and like maybe it gives me like a slight leg up, but I still have to put in a lot of work for it. So just be prepared that it's gonna be quite mentally taxing. And I'm sure, like, we were speaking a bit before the podcast about your experience applying for these investment banks. Like, it's not an easy ride.
Yeah, I mean, so much I could say about advice, but I'll guess I add two things. Number one, a wise person told me, I think half an hour ago, about keeping the big picture in mind.
Yes.
And secondly, reach out to people who have gone through the process.
Definitely.
And they have it fresh in their memory of some of the mistakes they've made and what they have done. And that's actually the best way to probably get a ton of advice with a particular context. And anyone listening, particularly freshers, you're certainly welcome to reach out to me, and I'm sure Max would also be very happy. But rapid fire questions. We talked about books, but what's your favourite song? And you can't say Canterbury Pie.
Oh god. Canterbury Pie.
Or maybe it is your favourite.
Yeah, I did listen to the full 8 minutes. There are some great lyrics, especially like the Cooler Boys and POIs, which I have no idea who Sal is referring to there. What is my favourite song? Oh god. I love indie pop, indie rock. But I'm gonna say Common People.
Best date that you've been on?
Best date? Well, I think I'm gonna be in a lot of trouble if I don't say like my first date with my girlfriend. So I don't know how much I wanted to divulge, but went to a park and it was very nice.
Great. Favourite soft drink?
Very Rishi Sunak of me, but Diet Coke.
Max Goose in 2 words. And you can't say Max Goose. Or 3 if you want, but yeah. What would you like people to associate with you? Perhaps characteristics, perhaps things.
Okay. 3 words. On the ball.
On the ball.
That's 3 words.
What would be the title of your autobiography or biography?
Am I allowed to say Arena of Ambition? The title of my autobiography. I'll take a Theresa May quote for my sins, but just about managing.
Cool. And what's the one country that you really want to visit?
Cuba.
Why?
So I'm not sure how much everyone knows about Cuba, but it's been under a blockade by the US since the 60s. Let me be clear, I really disagree with their political system, with their government, dictatorship, Castro, whatnot. But I think it's just such a world apart from how we live, and their cars are all from the 60s. Sorry, I wasn't quick fire, but...
Great. Final one, which you must answer within less than half a minute, because I know you can probably talk 5 hours on it, but are you ready for Rishu?
Am I ready for half a minute? Okay, so if I were to describe myself, I am a small c conservative who is disillusioned with the Conservative Party. I think neither of the candidates are the best candidates, but if I were to pick one, and if I had a membership, I am not a member, if I had a membership, I would vote for Rishi Sunak.
Well, congratulations for basically surviving the podcast. How have you found it?
I found it really, really good. Very, again, yeah, as you said, quite emotional. I do like talking about myself, but sometimes I realise things which I didn't really think about, and then you bring them to the front of my thoughts. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great. Well, it's been a pleasure having you, Max, and I'm sure I'll have more chats with you. But all the best. I know you've got a busy summer ahead, and keep working hard and keep keeping the bigger picture in mind. I'm sure that you will get to where you want to. Best of luck.
Thank you, David.